Let's start with the Craft Beverage Modernization and Tax Reform Act, because we were just writing about that this week, and it now has majority support in the Senate. On my notes from yesterday, which could have changed, we had 52 co-sponsors on that bill. What's the latest? Is that still accurate?
Well, I'm happy to report we have 53 as of today
All
in the
right.
U.S. Senate.
Who was the latest? Because the last I saw was Susan Collins in Maine.
Collins was the latest. I think Mazie Hirono from Hawaii and Susan Collins were the last two.
Okay, so 52 co-sponsors, 53 total. And in the House, we have 162 representatives in the House?
Yep, 162 is the number we got today.
Okay. Now
And I'm sure from the hill climb yesterday, we're going to, get double digits more coming on in the next week or so.
And that was going to be my question. You guys were walking the hill yesterday, a lot of brewers out there. What was the response on Craft Beverage Modernization Tax Reform Act?
Real positive. It seems to be an easier sell since it's already in place than years past when we had to get it into place. And so people were real responsive. Not too many questions about it. People were very well informed about it. And it was a good climb. We got to 98 of the Senate offices and over 300 of the House offices, and so it was pretty successful.
So for those who aren't maybe as familiar with the bill, it would make federal excise taxes for all brewers and importers permanent. Right now, it is set to wrap up at the end of this year. So I guess that's sort of the big question is what's it going to take to make these federal excise tax cuts permanent and move it beyond 2019 and into 2020? And I'll start with Paul, and then we'll kind of go down the line.
It takes the will of Congress. They have to really want to do this. We did have a meeting at the Joint Committee on Taxation on Tuesday, and we're working on getting a better score for it so that when it is scored again, the issue of imported beer or imported spirits, being able to find loopholes in it is less of a concern, and that it doesn't affect the score negatively. So I feel generally that it's pretty positive. We had Senator Wyden up with us on Wednesday evening at our pre-climb reception, and he said, making this permanent is something I'm going to make happen.
Well, that's some good news. Jim, obviously it's been huge for the industry, $130 million in savings annually for the beer industry, $80 million in annual savings for craft brewers alone. In terms of making these excise taxes permanent, is it possible that a bill like this can be voted on it by itself, or will it need to kind of ride along with something else?
I think at this moment, without some more clarity on the score, meaning a lower number on the score, it's very unlikely it would be a standalone bill. But I mean, as Paul said, it takes the will of Congress. And in our case, the will of Congress means a vehicle, a bill that we can tag along onto at any point in the year from now until December 31st when the tax relief lapses. So the two nice things this year that I think are an improvement from last year. Number one, we've gotten to 53 and 163 faster than we did 2 years ago when we introduced the bill. We introduced the bill in the House in early February and in the Senate in mid-February. That's not that long ago, and we've already got a majority of senators heading for a supermajority of senators, number one. And number two, we have a lot of freshmen on the bill. So these are freshmen, mainly Democrats, who haven't been around before. This bill, the craft beverage mod bill, was part of a very controversial Republican tax relief bill, tax reform bill. Yet we're getting a lot of Democratic freshmen and Democratic former co-sponsors to sign on. So it just shows the importance of the relationships we all have, the importance of you all being here, being up on the Hill, having so many meetings, the importance of our trade association lobbyists every day being up on the Hill and getting those co-sponsors. So our job now is to get as many co-sponsors as possible, watch the landscape of how the year is going, and be ready to jump on whatever tax train is leaving the station. And I think we will get one before the end of the year.
And I would just add that I think Jim hit the nail on the head. I mean, this bill that this was part of back in 17 was a very different. I'm sorry. Yes, in 2017 was very different because it was very partisan. This was a piece of legislation that only had one party support it in total. So I think it's a tremendous tribute to all the people that are watching this and all the people in this industry of putting their differences aside and working together to build this kind of momentum, because that's really important. Because I think we've got 110 new members of the House and Senate. That is nearly 20% of a turnover. I've been in this town for a long time, and I can't recall that many new faces. So, hats off to BA for your work this week. We had a fly-in just less than a month ago at about 700 people in town. We made it clear to Congress that we were supportive of this effort, and I think cheers to all of you for a great start to something that's going to be a lot of work between now and 2020.
So the NBWA is supporting craft beverage, because, correct me if I'm wrong, you guys haven't necessarily taken an official position on it.
We've been supportive of this effort since the most recent iteration of this came together, and I think that's something that a lot of times people forget, because that was a great example of really all three associations kind of pushing reset and going back to the drawing board and saying, we have some concerns. This was about the previous bill. Beer Institute had some concerns about the previous bill. And we were able to kind of cobble together something that everybody could be supportive of, and that's exactly where we are.
Yeah. So let's talk sort of worst case scenario here. If this bill doesn't pass, what's the next option? Is there another extender option?
First thing I want to do is paint the picture of what happens in the media in early 2020 if this doesn't pass and taxes double for small brewers in just about every congressional district. That's not a pretty picture for the members of Congress. So in my mind, it seems like they're going to have to respond pretty quickly. If they don't do it this year, they're going to have to respond quickly next year.
Yeah.
And make it retroactive.
But this is sort of an all or nothing shot then, it sounds like. There's no alternative or no backup plan if there's no opportunity for another extension, anything like that?
There are already tax extenders that have expired at the end of 2018 that have lapsed. Those tax extenders are more than likely going to be reset and made retroactive, as Paul says. So, I think this is going to happen, and I think it's actually going to happen before December 31st. So, you always have to have a plan B, right? But you don't find too many bills that after 9 weeks of introduction have half the U.S. Senate on it and a growing number heading for 200 House members. This is an easy sell for us to get people on the bill. We have super support amongst the legislative leaders in both houses. We have tremendously plugged in and motivated authors of our bill. So we have lots of advantages. So we have to just take advantage of those advantages. But if the bill lapses on December 31st, then yes, we have to go back and find that vehicle in early 2020. And as Paul says, there will be plenty of arguments. And let's not forget, we're already getting whacked on the aluminum tariffs as an industry.
Yep.
So we're already giving it the office here. So I can't imagine that we're going to see brewers get hit in yet another way.
And I would just offer, from an observational standpoint, the whole notion of extenders is nothing new. I mean, Congress has great ability to procrastinate and kick the can. And we've seen all kinds of other tax provisions that have gone right up until the following year's deadline, and then they get inserted into that reconciliation or that final package. So, I hate to be very realistic, but I mean, our work is, and everybody here's work is going to be ongoing.
Yeah, tax extenders in Washington, D.C. is like the swallows coming to Capistrano every year. I mean, this just is part of the fabric of what we do in Washington, D.C. So I think it's going to get extended. That's why I'm also bullish on permanence. If it doesn't happen this year, it's going to happen in the next iteration of the bill. I mean, about 7 or 8 years ago, Congress had a whole discussion for many months about taking all the extenders at that moment and making them permanent, and they did. And that's probably how we'll get our permanence in the end. We'll be part of a larger group of extenders that everyone sees as consensusly, from a consensus perspective, good policy, and then they become permanent.
Yeah. So, I mean, you think about it, though, and we'll talk about the tariffs in a sec. There are, I don't know, 1,000 to 2,000 or so breweries that have launched in the last 2 years that don't know anything different other than the excise taxes that they're paying. So, again, worst case scenario, the tax structure reverts back to what it was prior to 2017, prior to this reform being written in. What's the ramification on businesses that have recently launched that will now pay double the federal excise tax for many of them?
Yeah, I mean, 2,000 breweries have never paid the higher rate. So it'd be brand new, and it's probably not part of their financial model. So it could be pretty damaging.
You think
although a lot of
layoffs
those breweries are small, so we're not talking about a huge amount of money for them.
Right.
But for some of them, $300 is a lot of money.
Yeah.
It means another sack of grain.
Those people vote, and their employees vote, and what the member of Congress will hear is that you just raised my taxes. Why'd you do that?
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is for those new marketplace entrants, I mean, part of due diligence whenever you enter into a business dynamic is to understand, the tax and regulatory implications. I mean, anybody that launched a brewery in the last 2,000, if that's the number of folks that have entered since this, that's got to be part of what you're planning for. You've got to be thinking about all these many and varied. This is a highly regulated industry, and it's amazing to see the number of entrants that we've seen and how much excitement has been created by these new marketplace entrants. But understanding the tax and the regulatory dynamic has got to be part of what you're planning for constantly.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they're used to $3.50 a barrel, not $7 a barrel. So at the larger end of some of these new category entrants, 5,000, 10,000 barrels of production annually, I mean, we're talking about a sizable increase, should it revert back to the earlier rates. And, there are concerns about potential layoffs or, halting expansion plans, things like that. Is that the message that you guys brought up to, the Hill yesterday, Paul, with your members?
Yeah, that and the message of uncertainty. When you don't know what's going to happen, say, with tariffs or with the excise tax rate, you're less likely to invest in something. If you don't know what the price of something is going to be when it hits the dock, that's a problem, and you're a little less likely to do that. And it's competitive out there, over 7,400 breweries, so it's, decisions are tough, especially when it comes to capacity.
Yeah, having something to count on certainly matters. So we've touched on the tariff and trade issue a little bit. Let's dive into it. Earlier this year, Jim, your organization conducted a study and found that the beverage industry was actually paying out $250 million for aluminum can sheet, but the Department of the Treasury took in just $50 million from that. And essentially what it amounted to was that, beverage makers are paying 100% of the tariff on can sheet as if it was all imported, but 70% of it is recycled and made from scrap metal. So it sounds like beverage makers are getting fleeced here.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't need to tell the brewers in the room how complicated the aluminum market is and how difficult it is to find a good price for aluminum, right? So there is nothing good about the aluminum tariffs and the steel tariffs, particularly the aluminum tariffs. We estimated it was a $350 million annual tax on the brewing industry in the United States. The numbers that you just quoted, Chris, were from the end of March to the end of December for the entire beverage industry. And you hear President Trump talking about how much money the Treasury is taking in from these tariffs and how great it is. But we are in an industry that is a perfect example of why that might not be completely true. The Treasury took in $50 million as opposed to brewers paying $250 million. So there's a lot wrong with the policy. There's a lot wrong with the structure of the aluminum industry. There's a lot wrong about the pricing of the industry, how the aluminum is priced. We're seeing the tariff being charged on all aluminum, including scrap aluminum, right now. So we need the tariffs repealed completely. There's sort of breaking news just since your meeting today started that it looks like the U.S., Canadian, and Mexican governments have a deal to take the tariffs off Canadian and Mexican aluminum. Canadian aluminum amounts to about 43% of the aluminum you all use for your products. That's good, but that's just a start. We need to get rid of these aluminum tariffs completely. We need to engage policymakers in a discussion, which we're already doing, about the goofiness of how aluminum is priced and get that changed. So there's a lot here. I think if this deal comes to pass where the exemptions go back on for Canada and Mexico as of Monday, that's a good start, but there's a lot more that we have to do on this issue.
Yeah.
And I would add, I think Jim's group, the Beer Institute, has done an excellent job of highlighting kind of the story behind the story, which is the manipulation of the marketplace related to the Midwest Premium. And I think, that is part of kind of our ongoing, industry advocacy. We've got a lot of policymakers that are paying attention to this, and that's positive. That's good. That's good for the industry. It's good for the business as it relates to an increase in the cost of goods sold that really there's no rhyme or reason to. Well, actually there is, and it's actually making some people some money, but it's at the cost of everyone that is using this very important product.
And the latest tariff that hit the Federal Register today is $300 billion from China. Does include brewery machinery as a 25% item.
And that was going to be, my next question, which is, President Trump has escalated that trade war with China in the last week or so. As you said, $300 billion worth of goods now going from a 10% tariff to a 25% tariff. So there is brewery equipment included in those goods?
That's right, and there's a comment period that goes until about this time in June, I think 22nd or so. There is a comment period, so if you're thinking about getting any brewery machinery from China, you should probably file a comment.
So other than the
machine, we'll probably file comments as an association as well.
Other than the machinery, what impact does something like the higher tariffs on China have specifically on the beer industry?
Well, the retaliatory actions by the other countries, China specifically, but others, really kind of just perpetuate this really ridiculous policy. I mean, it's not a secret, especially when Paul Ryan was Speaker of the House, but Mitch McConnell as the leader of the Senate and Ryan with big beer chops in Wisconsin both saw targets from the EU around exported alcohol products. And that's part of the rest of the story that we all are so kind of off the bench on. I mean, this is not what, and realizing there was a lot of rhetoric around this during the election and a lot of things, you get what you pay for in some situations. But that has been, I think, a wake-up call for all of us in the trade space.
Donald Trump is, what shall we say, an unpredictable president. I mean, he's no Republican president other than him would be doing these tariffs. We all in industry say we understand the objective of this to make trade fairer, but these are real costs. So I like to say government gives with one hand and takes with the other for beer. So a $130 million tax cut for brewers, but a $350 million tax increase just on the steel and aluminum, not to mention the 301 tariffs. And some of these products that are on the 301 list are not products that you can buy in the U.S. So it's really related to trade, related to a lot of things. With the president, it's a sort of a constant advocacy and educational process, which you just got to keep doing. Because there is not going to be any end in sight to this, at least in the short term. or at least in the long term. At least in the short term, though, we do know that I think that this newly revised exemption for Canada and Mexico on steel and aluminum says they're at least open to listening a little bit. So that's a good thing. So we just got to keep at it.
Yeah. Well, it's you said that President Trump is unpredictable. I mean, I would maybe say he's uncompromising in some of these things. It seems impossible to, get his ear on any of these issues that affect a lot of businesses, within the beer industry and outside of the beer industry. So, I guess, how does a trade group like the NBWA or the BI or the BA go about, convincing the powers that be that, hey, these tariffs are bad for business and we need to get this fixed and we need to get this solved? Like, what's the approach when somebody is unwilling to back down?
If you're not getting satisfaction on one end of Pennsylvania Avenue, you go to the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue and try to get satisfaction there. I mean, you find your openings, you advocate for your industry in a sort of 360 kind of way. You talk about the jobs, you talk about the importance that beer has to our American culture. You talk about the renaissance of beer over the last 30 years. There's a lot, we have a lot of ammunition to go up and talk to the policymakers. I mean, having said that, the White House is not a closed door on this issue. We have plenty of opportunities to talk to them. And for me, as an advocate, more talking leads to the outcome you want. That's generally how it works. We just have to hope that this is how it works here. So again, lifting the Canadian, or putting the exemptions back on for Canada, which is 43% of the foreign aluminum coming into the country, is very helpful. I take that as an interim victory. We just got to go get the rest of the pie now.
What role did your organizations play in that?
What role did we play? I mean, gosh, I think that we've been one of the industries that's more out front about the impact of the tariffs on U.S. business. Reporters like to talk about beer, so it's an easy thing for Americans who don't understand trade, which is a highly complicated area. Beer is an easily accessible item for Americans to understand the broader picture. So we get calls from reporters to talk about it, and we take every opportunity to do that. So we are, I think, as an industry, leaders on talking about the effects that this has on American business, and that's very helpful to us.
And one of the things we did when this was first announced with the administration was we got very proactive with some of the senior leadership in the House of Representatives. It seems like a small issue as it relates to the dynamics here in Washington. We talk about it being unique, but this trade issue was really the first time that the president's own party's leaders stepped into the breach and opposed him on a major policy initiative. Laurie Knight, who's our Vice President of Government Affairs, and I ran into a senior Republican not long after this was announced, and it was very interesting because this person was organizing a group of colleagues to sign a letter to the president. And the exchange went like this. We said, we would love to help you get more signatures. And his response was, well, don't tell anybody that I'm doing this because I don't want to get in trouble. And I mean, I know that sounds counterintuitive, and that was 18 months ago, but it's illustrative of what we've got to do to try to change the dynamic. I think anytime you have a policymaker that maybe steps out, and that certainly has happened with this administration, you always want to give the other person the opportunity to turn around. And yes, this has taken longer than we thought, but obviously very good news if there's a negotiated settlement that relieves 43% at least of the can sheet challenge for the industry.
One of the points we tried to make in the media was not to just say, oh, this tariff is bad, but to separate the reason for the tariff, which was military applications of aluminum, and the can sheet aluminum, which does not have the military applications.
Yeah, making that distinction is obviously key. And we've obviously reported on, seen, heard the effects that it's having on, beer businesses specifically in our world. But I haven't heard too much groaning from breweries or consumers and seeing this kind of trickle down to the end drinker. Have you guys seen the price of beer increase to the end consumer as a result of these tariffs? Have you seen any of your members complaining about having to raise prices specifically because of the aluminum tariffs? Like, I haven't heard too much of that, but then again, you guys are much closer to it than I am.
You haven't heard that big giant groan coming out of Chicago, Illinois, that $40 million groan from Miller Coors?
I guess I mean at the smaller end, for smaller brewers.
We've heard, Paul can answer this too, obviously, but we've heard from a lot of our members about the impact that it's having. I mean, I've got the numbers here for Summit Brewing. It means $160 million in taxes. Cape May, $160,000 for Summit.
Yeah.
Wow, Summit's pretty big. Holy shit.
He was real excited for a minute.
Mark Stutrod's doing something great out there in
Yeah,
St.
go
Paul.
Mark, go.
Cape May, 30,000. I mean, I wonder, folks in the room, what the impact is. Those sort of $30,000 tax bills add up when you've got 7,000 breweries. So, I think the problem is you have 7,000 individual businesses who sort of have to decide how they're going to deal with this issue. They can raise prices, which I don't think probably too many of you in the room really want to do, right? They can eat the cost in some other way. Going back to what you said earlier, if we don't get the tax relief extended, is that going to impact the jobs that people want to create, the infrastructure changes to their breweries that they want to make, the other impacts to the business when money's going out the door in a way that you weren't aware it was going to 6 months earlier. So, I mean, I think those are the strategies that you have. You don't have too many options, though. So if you want to raise prices, I guess you can do that. But I don't think you're going to be, sort of pronouncing that from the rafters either.
Yeah.
What the scan data shows and what we've been hearing from craft brewers is that they did not pass along the increased costs and pricing. So this was actually 2018 was one of the lower years in terms of increased pricing for craft beer. So I think the answer is most of them ate it.
Yeah. So then how do you get the, sort of average beer drinker to rally behind something like this? And maybe you don't need them to, per se. I mean, obviously it's the businesses that are doing the heavy lifting, but you talk about going into the media and making your case and being very vocal about this issue. If the consumer isn't being directly impacted, I think they probably just say, well, my beer still costs the same, so who cares, right?
Well, I think that some of this is we're hoping that this plane is going to land, and it's not going to land itself. But that's why we're working so actively to have a step us towards success, like Canada and Mexico. We've been asked, our organization, to support the replacement for NAFTA, and our response to the folks that we're asking was, not until you take care of these tariffs first. I mean, how can we go and with a straight face spend the industry's capital politically in advancing a specific trade agreement while we're so exposed? And so that's part of it. I think the other part of this is anytime you have an increase in cost of goods sold, there's a tail on that. That takes a little bit of time. And I can envision a industry kind of grassroots effort around this if it continues. But I think a lot of us were really spending our efforts in first pushing, attempting to have the government push the reset button.
Yeah.
I think so much of this is, particularly on an issue like trade, an inside game. Businesses and trade associations can go up there and make the case that this will hurt their businesses, which means it hurts the consumer in the end. And I think we're seeing some success around that. But you're right. I mean, how do you get voters and consumers engaged? That's a little more tricky, particularly on a highly complex issue like trade policy.
pass along those costs. Then they'll get interested, right? I mean, it kind of seems that way in some regards. I mean, I know businesses don't want to do that, but if the consumer isn't being impacted directly, I don't see why they would care.
I think back to around 2008 when there was a hop shortage in the country, and some of our brewers were passing along some of those higher costs. And as a trade association, while we can't talk specifically about pricing, we can use language in the media that does provide a little bit of air cover for our members to let people know, that the price of hops have gone up significantly and let them draw their own conclusions.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, let's switch gears to another issue that I think impacted just about everyone in this room to some extent, and that was the government shutdown at the end of last year and beginning of this year. It ran from December 22nd until January 25th. It was the longest government shutdown in history. And it led to, a whole bunch of issues for brewers with label approvals. You had the TTB that had suspended operations, almost all their operations. And there was a backlog of nearly 10,000 label approval requests that needed to get processed once the government reopened. So, in mid-March, all of the trade groups, all the alcohol trade groups, all three of your groups, wrote a letter to the members of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees and urged them to fund the TTB for the full fiscal year of 2020 to the tune of $139 million. So what's the latest? How are those conversations going? And, what will that funding allow the TTB to do next year if it's approved?
Well, it would guarantee that the TTB would stay open to process permits, approve labels, and approve formulas. It's interesting that the one part of the TTB that was appropriated was investigations. Those didn't stop. But I don't know, Jim could probably speak a little more on what the prospects are.
Yeah, I don't think the authorization for the TTB funding hasn't happened yet this year. So, we have that letter out there with the 1 year appropriation. However, I can tell you, all three organizations on the stage here led getting the other alcohol beverage trade associations to come to the table even before the shutdown ended to start to talk about ways that we could protect TTB more in a future shutdown. As I said earlier, tax extenders is a regular annual discussion around here. I think with an unpredictable president and a divided Congress, shutdowns are likely going to be more of the norm than ever before. So the 6 or 7 organizations got together. We talked for several weeks about things we could do to keep the TTB running more smoothly in a shutdown environment, and we came up with some ideas related to 2-year funding as opposed to 1-year funding for TTB, and then alternatively, finding ways that other aspects of the TTB work beyond enforcement could be deemed critical in a shutdown. So we've put those ideas before Congress. Again, it's part of the bigger appropriations process. So we're hoping for a better outcome that will protect TTB in the probably sure to come next shutdown.
And I would just add the one other part of this discussion, and it really was a great exercise of all those same players that did come together to advocate for lower excise taxes, beer, wine, and spirits. We were all very concerned about this, but one of the things in talking with policymakers that all of us as citizens, whether you're in the DC area or whether you're in Middle America, the whole notion of shutting down government's a bad idea. We had government shutdowns with the previous administration. We've been at a partisan standoff with a number of fiscal cliffs since 2011. And I think when we look at this on all sides of the political spectrum, we've got to drive a more normal sense of return to regular order. We've got to recognize that when you shut down the government, you are putting people out of work. You are having employees that are doing their job day in and day out, whatever their role in government is, that aren't getting paid during that time period. And So I think in addition to these parochial issues that are very important, and we need to be fighting for those on behalf of our constituents in our industry, but we've got to be working to encourage those folks to keep the trains running on time and be more Main Street friendly, because anytime you have one of these shutdowns, it affects real people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it affects everything, not just an entity like the TTB.
And federal employees drink beer, for God's sakes. I mean, you know.
Well, I think there was a buy 'em a beer program.
There was
too.
a bunch of stuff. We had distributors out in the market all over the country that were doing different programs. We had one in South Texas that had, you know, a cookout and a beer party and all this stuff. They did something once a week during that time period. And, you know, this is a great industry. We do a lot for communities everywhere, all three tiers, and I think we've got to keep that in mind when these bigger issues confront us.
Jim, you said that, you know, it's quite likely that we'll see more of these shutdowns in the future. So what can brewers do to protect themselves and set themselves up ahead of those possible shutdowns so that they don't run into issues like, you know, waiting for a label approval on beer that's sitting in a tank, that type of thing?
It's probably hard to say, or probably hard to hear, but the more planning you do related to your interaction with the TTB, the better. Read the newspaper and watch how the federal government is operating to understand when a shutdown could come. But I think the more interaction you can have with your local TTB official related to various issues that you deal with, the better you can do in terms of planning for label submissions, the better, particularly as the rhetoric in Washington starts to heat up around, probably around the end of September when the next budget cliff is coming.
Yeah, label approvals are one thing, but one thing that we've noticed from the TTB in recent months is just how stepped up their enforcement seems to be on trade practice violations, things like pay-to-play. Heineken USA recently received, I think, the largest ever fine of $2.5 million. They call it an offer in compromise. So I guess Heineken USA agreed to pay $2.5 million for breaking the law. You know, I guess in your opinion, and there have been a number of wholesalers who've been slapped with, you know, pretty hefty fines as well. Is the TTB doing enough to curb the pay-to-play activities that we hear so frequently in the beer industry?
Well, one of the things we've been talking to TTB about more specifically is the whole notion of education, because, you know, it's great to have this rule book out there, but if people don't know what the rules are, it's very hard to play the game. And we've been talking for a number of years to our members very clearly about, about concerns about pay-to-play, about concerns related to trade practice violations. In addition to the federal dynamic, every state has a different regulatory structure, and all of our members, all brewers, all retailers need to be conscious of that structure and of those specific rules. But I do think TTB can do a better job of providing guidance, and this is very much a point of frustration. I'm drinking beer here, and it's a Friday afternoon, so somebody may have to come sit on me, but it has been very disappointing to see that lack of instruction, particularly for a number of rules that maybe haven't been enforced for a number of years. So we are constantly trying to make our members more aware. That includes making brewers more aware, obviously retailers as well, but really trying to get more out of TTB from a proactive, let's educate the industry together. It's a lot easier to enforce the rules if everybody knows them.
Well, I got to challenge you just briefly on that. I mean, many of your wholesaler members are generational businesses, so I would expect them to know the rules at this point, right, Craig?
No, that is true, but if a rule hasn't been enforced and there's not a regulator out there helping the industry understand the rules, we expect more. We expect more for that appropriation. We expect more for that from that regulatory agency. And I think in addition to that, that's educating all of these new brewers. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody needs, and I say that as much for, for all folks. I mean, everybody needs to know what the rules are, so that they can act in a more responsible way.
I agree. I think it seems to me there's been a inconsistency in the way the trade practices have been enforced over the years. So take some of that trade practice money that they use and put it into education for brewers, big and small and new and old, and for distributors. And there's an interaction here with the states as well, state enforcement. So there are clear rules to the road. They need to help educate people on what those rules are.
Yeah.
I like that the rules are being enforced now. TTB didn't have the money to do this in the past, where they would average 2 trade investigations a year. Now that we got them the money, we asked for full funding of TTB over the years, that they're doing over 50 investigations a year, I think it's a positive thing.
Yeah, definitely. So I know we got just a couple of minutes because you got to run off, Craig. But I did want to grab Paul just for a minute. Maybe a brief update on the BA's new political action committee. Where are we at on that? I mean, what's the latest? How much support do you have? How much funding do you have for that so far?
We set a goal of an internal goal of just north of $50,000 to raise this first year. Figuring we can start small. We will exceed that, and we have dispersed nothing of it yet. You know, we're still in the process of building a political action committee board to develop criteria to make the decisions for those dispersals. But the website is not up yet. We're working with a company called Aristotle that's doing a lot of that management for us. And that website should be up by the time I get back to Boulder next week.
Awesome. Well, you've got a long way to go to catch Craig in the NBWA. I think they're the largest in Washington, D.C., right? Or second largest?
I don't think we're the largest. We have a nice-sized political action committee. But, you know, it's interesting because when we talk about money in politics, there is a lot of other money that's out there. And, you know, obviously some of the regulatory changes in that arena, I think you can make the case that they've actually devalued political action committees. It doesn't mean, I mean, I think 50 grand is awesome. That is a fantastic kickoff, you know, and I do see you guys absolutely blowing the top off of that objective. But the whole notion of a political action committee is to be present. It's to be there, and it's to participate in the progress in the process. And so hats off to you guys for going that direction.
Yeah, no doubt.
I agree. I mean, we created a PAC 4 years ago, and it's just another sort of arrow in the quiver of political advocacy. We moved to a new office about 4.5 years ago, put the receptionist in the back and opened a bar in the front, and we have over 70 events a year where members come in either for political events or other kinds of events. And really, I find our bar to be the single greatest asset we have in sort of our arsenal of advocacy. So PACs are very important. Presence is very important. Hill climbs like the very successful one you all are having in the last couple days are very important. Events like Savor. We have a story to tell. Monday, for example, on the economic story, Monday, NBWA and BI will be releasing the biannual Beer Serves America report, which talks about the jobs in the industry and the economic contribution of our industry to the U.S. Those are all ways of helping on the issues. 53 senators on the most important policy issue brewers have, 160 plus, and moving towards 300 or more in the House. So these are all tactics that can be used in a very comprehensive way to tell your story.
Yeah. So is this the most unified the beer industry has been, at least from a trade group perspective? It seems like you guys are kind of fighting the fight together, you know, lockstep on most issues, and even working with wine and spirits on some of them as well.
I'd say it's by far the best communication between the three groups that we've certainly done. But, you know, of course, everybody's going to advocate for their own members' issues. And so unified, that depends if the issues are unified at any given time in history.
And I would add that, the whole notion of being able to communicate, I think Paul hit the nail on the head. It's, we can disagree and we can, have, different views of particular policy issues. That's part of what makes this industry great. But we can, Henry King, which isn't necessarily a name that everybody in this room's familiar with, but he was the former president of the U.S. Brewers Association, and then for a period came out of retirement, was head of the Brewers Association of America. And Henry talked about the whole notion of being able to disagree without being disagreeable. And I think that's something that we're probably doing a better job of.
I think to that point, I think there's also fewer issues that we will diverge on as brewers and distributors in Washington, D.C. We only do, I like to say we only do Washington politics, but we do it very well. We're not in the States, and I read BBD and Brewbound and BMI, and I see the fights that are happening in the States. That's a different battleground than Washington, D.C. We can be much more aligned, in my view, in Washington, D.C. on these bigger policy issues.
Well, it's a great place to end because Craig's going to get off the snide on my franchise reform questions here.
I'm here as long as you want me here. I mean, I'm serious.
All right. Well, if we got time for one more, then let's just lob it out there. I mean, there's a lot of franchise reform efforts at the state level happening. We've seen it in New York. There's ongoing discussions in Massachusetts. We've seen reform in Maryland and North Carolina. I guess what's everybody's take on the appropriate way to reform some of the franchise laws across the country now that the industry looks completely different from when these laws were written 30, 40 years ago?
Looking at me. I think very much it's a state-by-state issue. What's going to work for Vermont may not work for Nebraska. There are different issues there. But I do believe that a lot of the basis in franchise laws were to protect the smaller wholesalers from the larger brewers. Well, now the situation is opposite. Smaller brewers are now in franchise situations with larger distributors. And so the laws are not serving the same reason today that they did when they were originally formed. And, there's to see, states this year pass some franchise law reform that does allow some brewers to move, I think has been some pretty positive developments. And I think we've got a struggle coming up in California where there's an effort to restrict franchise laws more, or have more restrictive franchise laws.
Yeah, and I would, no surprise, we'll take a little bit different tact. I mean, in 1983, there were fewer than 50 breweries in the United States. 50. Fewer than 50 breweries. I'm not talking about of major brewers. I'm talking of all brewers. And today, depending on how you're counting, and if you're jumping up and down on one leg and squinting your eye or whatever, but it's over 7,000 breweries that are in operation. And I think that's an American success story. That is an amazing, amazing accomplishment. And so the whole dynamic is that the number of brewers has grown, and it's been a wildly successful system. And franchise laws, in its simplest term, have been part of that regulatory environment. It has allowed existing distributors of large brands to take risk and take on new manufacturers. It's been part of that success. It's how you can get a beer manufactured in Delaware in the state of California. It's because of an independent distribution system. And then we fast forward and we look at, like we do, and a lot of these laws have evolved. There's been a lot of change over time. But we had just this past year in California 4 very publicized terminations without cause. And it wasn't by necessarily, and it was by a large brewer, but it was very disruptive. And it called into question, that trust. These were all distributors that were highly performing, that had built the brands, that were meeting the obligation of their contract. And that manufacturer, because of a lack of a specific beer franchise law in that state, said, you know what, after 25 years, no gold watch, you're out. And that is problematic. And so that is a great example as to why distributors feel that these laws are so important.
But there was a gold watch. They were compensated.
They were compensated, but they were not compensated by the brewery. They were compensated by another distributor.
Yes, sir.
And well, not a successor. They were terminated and forced to sell their business. So let's call it what it is, and that's just part of it. We've got to be honest about that, and if we're going to have discussions around these kinds of issues, each side's got to understand where the other side's coming from.
But, with two parties making a contract that, should be mutually beneficial, the terms of that separation should be in there, don't you think?
It depends. It depends on what allows that distributor to take that risk to grow that brand. And again, you can look at success story after success story of brewer that has benefited from an independent distribution system. And I think those laws are absolutely essential to that independence. I mean, you begin to see it with smaller brands, with bigger small brands that object to somebody coming into my house. And we're not going to do business with you if you take so-and-so such and such. I mean, these are ongoing discussions, and they're very real. And I think as brewers look to grow beyond the tasting room, and they look to go more than 25 miles away, and they look to get beyond self-distribution, all of these kinds of issues get a very fresh workout and consideration. So, I think this is not a conversation we should shy away from.
No.
So I appreciate you letting me stick around to take the beating. But
I don't know who's giving or taking the beating here, Craig.
no. But I mean, this is real stuff. This
Yeah.
is what it's all about.
Well, I think there's an element of also kind of trying to look at where the puck is going here too. And we see what's happening with self-distribution and direct-to-consumer sales. And, some of these businesses are probably going to want to distribute their beer within a smaller radius. And it probably just doesn't make a whole ton of sense to give it, especially in rural areas, to give it to a wholesaler. I mean, you look at a state like Georgia where they're, preparing for potential franchise reform effort as well, this year and into next year when they can actually vote on
Are you
it.
picking on rural America? No.
Well, I mean, there's, examples of breweries that are, 100 miles away from a warehouse, and, a distributor needs to pick up 10 kegs, drive it back, bump the dock, and then just drive it right back to distribute it, all because there is no self-distribution, and, these brewers are forced into the three-tier system. So
But self-distribution is allowed in a majority of jurisdictions. I mean, that's a fact.
yeah, but if you look at it from a some of these brewers will want to take back their self-distribution rights and would freely compensate the wholesaler. And if there's no ability for them to do that in a franchise reform, then how is it even possible?
Right, but again, I mean, actually, self-distribution is a great example of a rule and a law and a regulatory dynamic that has evolved over time. And so, that is something that to me, is much more the exception than the rule now. But the whole notion of being able to take risk and build brands in some of these cases to where you have built this brand so well that it is bigger than what was your previous primary supplier. I mean, and let's talk about going to where the puck is, because the whole deal is the puck means, I think for small brewers, the puck needs more points of distribution. It needs a stronger independent distribution system. The whole dynamic of two systems may not be sufficient to get all these many and varied products to market at scalable distribution. So I think we've got to be looking at reforms that get more people into this business.
Into the distribution business.
Into the distribution business.
Yeah.
That has got to be part of this holistic approach. And is it going to be a state-by-state approach? Yes. Because that is what has given rise to a terribly successful alcohol industry. When you look at other marketplaces and you look at the lack of choice and the lack of diversity, and you look at the shrinking number of entrants to the marketplace, America is a wild success story. And each one of these state marketplaces is successful too.
I think about franchise laws currently as creating an obstacle to opportunity for a lot of the distributors. That there's a lot of brewers in this country, maybe thousands, that are not interested in getting into distribution because they're afraid of being caught up in a wholesaler who may or may not have their best interests for them, 3, 5, 7 years down the road. And so I think something that carves out the smaller brewers probably does make sense in a lot of states.
Well, and one of those things that, I think we've talked about some with leadership of the BA and with some of the guilds is the whole notion of you got to document and you got to exercise your rights under the law. And that means if you're not happy with your partner's performance, there are remedies for that. There's not a state in the country that prohibits termination for cause. I mean, that's the facts. I mean, document, terminate, those kinds of activities we haven't seen in a number of places. And
Very hard to prove.
And brands transfer, hundreds of brands transfer every single year. A number of states have started tracking this, and whether it's people buying brands or distribution privileges, or whether it's trades, or it's a distributor and a brewer getting together and saying, you know what, it ain't working. Let's go our separate ways. There's a bunch of success around that too, and so that's got to be part of the conversation as well.
Yeah, I feel like I'm up here watching a tennis match. This is a good and important debate that I think shows two things. The first is the battleground of state policy and the importance of states in making alcohol policy, and number one. And number two, that we don't agree on everything. But I do think there's one issue that we need to talk about, which is we're all sort of, this debate is moot unless we get more people drinking beer.
Yep.
The groups up here, our various members have been talking about solutions to the beer category health problem as opposed to talking about the problem, which was a long navel-gazing discussion, I think, in beer for a number of years. So we're on to fixing it. That has its own complications, but we're trying to work through that. So I don't want to end this discussion, which has been great, on sort of a negative. So everybody, I think this beer growth initiative is super important.
And I would just add, it's a great example because BA and BI have been very involved in this, and we are making some great progress. I don't know how familiar folks are on the audience, but the overall decline of beer as a preference of alcohol beverages, especially among legal drinking age consumers, is a huge problem. And I think as we're looking at continuing to make investments in this industry and to grow beer's share of the licensed beverage pie, we've got to be able to walk and chew gum. We've got to be able to have passionate discussions about things that we don't agree on, but also passionate discussions about what we do agree on.
I agree. Paul, the final word?
I think the point in the unity question was well served. We are going to be communicating on all sorts of issues. We're going to engage with the beer growth initiative as is appropriate. We do need to grow beer. Alcohol is under attack from a lot of different directions, and I'm really grateful that I'm in the beverage alcohol industry.
Hear, hear. All right. Well, big round of applause for these three guys up here, our previous panel. Everybody that showed out today, appreciate you.